let's talk about some of the myths around pro audio. Let's dig in. So in this game, you always hear things about how you should be working. You hear things like, my mate said this, my mate always does this guy I worked with always did this girl that I was listening to tells me to do this stuff. I hear it all the time, so I thought I would address some of them. But before we do that, I'm going to ask you to like, subscribe, comment and share. It's really useful for me. I'm getting kind of closer to that 500 mark, which means that I can start hyping some of my stuff. And if you find any of my content useful and you fancy buying me a cup of coffee, there's a link below. So these are the 10 more common things that I hear. Some of them are true, some of them are utter nonsense, and we're going to talk them through today. So first up, egg boxes are good for soundproofing. False. Oh my god, so unbelievably false. Egg boxes are absolutely useless for soundproofing. They are also absolutely useless for improving the sound of your room. They're not absorbent enough to absorb anything that's floating around in your room that's going to be causing you problems, and they're not reflective enough to bounce stuff away and scatter sound. Do you know what they're really good for though? Transporting eggs. Alright, next up, you can mix on headphones. True. There is nothing wrong with mixing on headphones, and actually there's loads of people doing it all the time. And the other cool thing is there's loads of technology out there that's helping to improve that. The bottom line is if you understand what you're mixing on, if you understand the sound of your headphones or any monitor speaker you're using, then you can do a perfectly good mix. You just need to know how they should sound. You need to know how the bass responds in them. Now, one thing I would say is that you're definitely better to use open back headphones if you can, because when it's closed back headphones, there is a build up of sound and that's going to cloud your judgment. So the open back ones are going to let the sound escape and give you a clearer picture. You could also use some of the software solutions out there, such as Slate System and Wave System, which emulate the sound of a room and basically deal with some of the problems you might come up against when mixing in headphones. But do you know what? If it works for you, just get it done. Okay, next up, you can easily soundproof any room. False. Soundproofing a room is really fucking hard. And actually, in a lot of cases, the best that you can expect is to reduce the sound significantly. One of the best ways I can kind of describe this is imagine that you were filling up a room with water. If there's anywhere the water can escape, you can guarantee that sound's going to escape too. It is super complex to fully soundproof a room. You need to decouple the room from the structure of the building, which is why you have a raised floor or a floating floor. Sound needs to pass through certain absorbent materials such as rock wool, then that air needs to cool before it moves on to the next round of rock wool and then cools again. And hopefully by the time it gets through those layers of rock wool, blank space where it can cool down, and more rock wool and more blank space, then you get attenuation. But it is really hard. I had a studio of my own once. I tried to soundproof the room and it was nigh on impossible. There were so many ways that it could escape and I just couldn't make it work. Employing a company to help you who've got experience in that is really useful, but honestly it is not easy. And again, remember, fully soundproofing, very difficult. The best you can really expect is a significant attenuation or drop in volume that leaks out around you. Okay, next up, better sound cards or converters will give you better mixes. Well, this is true and false. It's false when you're mixing in the box, and it's true when you're mixing analog. So to explain, when you're mixing fully in the box using nothing but plugins, when you bounce down your mix, all of the processing is done in the computer. Your converters are not utilised bouncing down. So it doesn't matter if you've got the cheapest converters out there or the most expensive, all of the bounce happens in the computer and there is no sonic difference whatsoever. However, if you're using an analog system or just have analog components, you can't do an in-the-box bounce. What you're going to do is you're going to play your audio through all of these components, such as your mixing desk, compressors, EQs, etc., and then you're going to re-record that back into your DAW. The quality of your converters in that case does matter. If you've got great converters, that will make a difference. But honestly guys, if you are mixing in the box, don't fret. Just get it bounced. The computer will be doing all the heavy lifting. Next, you don't need to worry about gain staging. False. Gain staging's become a pretty big topic at the moment. Loads of people think it's absolute nonsense, and there's a load of other people that think it's super important. I think what's interesting is with things like 32-bit float, we don't have to worry as much, but we do have to worry about it. If you record something and it digitally clips, it's going to sound like shit. End of story. If you're using something like a Focusrite Scarlett, you should pay attention to your gain staging, because digital clipping is not nice and it isn't the same as analog clipping. You can run an analog mixing desk a little bit hotter and that can sound quite pleasing. It's going to bring in some really nice analog style harmonic distortion, but digital distortion is shite. So if you're clipping on the way in using a digital converter, it's going to sound terrible. Now where it gets slightly complicated is that people talk a lot about gain staging to get the best out of plugins, and whilst there's a little bit of truth in that for sure, particularly with analog style or modeled plugins, but generally speaking I wouldn't worry about that too much. Worry about making sure that you don't clip on the way in and you don't clip on the way out, and you'll be absolutely fine. Next up, analog is better than digital. Sorry, it's true. Been doing this for 16 years. I've worked on vintage analog and I've worked on split new digital stuff, and analog still sounds better. The thing with digital is it's bound by capacity, it's processing power, whereas analog is mechanical, almost like a kind of lossless vibe. When your signal goes through capacitors and transformers and valves in an analog chain, it adds harmonic content to it, and that sounds really pleasing. What digital's trying to do is recreate that, but it doesn't always do a perfect job because it's almost like a snapshot in time rather than this kind of physical, alive, breathing thing. In the case of tape, that definitely sounds better. Tape is a lossless format, it's not bound by capacity like your computer is. Your computer is bound by storage and it's bound by processing power, but tape isn't. And the other cool thing about tape is you can actually drive it harder. You don't have to worry so much about gain staging, because actually when it distorts in the analog world, it is actually quite pleasing, unlike digital, which sounds like shit when it's digitally clipping. So why are we using digital? Simple, it's convenience. Pro Tools won the war because it was way more convenient than tape. As much as tape sounds great, it's a total pain in the arse to work with. There's a lot of stuff that you've got to do to maintain tape, calibrate tape. Don't even start me on editing. And Pro Tools or any other DAW you might be using does this instantaneously. So the convenience factor absolutely wins over the sonic factor. Now, digital sounds great. There's no doubt about it, okay? And I'm not going to get into that argument, but analog still sounds better. Trust me. Alright, next up, and something that really pisses me off, compression helps you get more volume. False. I can't tell you the amount of times that people have said to me, oh, if you want more volume, use compression. Why do we say that? Because we're obsessed with compression. We think it's the answer to all our prayers, and it isn't. So if you've got a situation where the fader is up full in your DAW and you need more volume, a lot of people are going to turn to a compressor to get more volume. That's utter shite. The simple solution, and it is unbelievably simple, is that if you can't get that fader any higher and you need more volume, turn the other faders down. Common sense prevails. Now I know that makes me sound like a middle-aged boomer, but do you know what? It's just true, okay? Not that I'm a middle-aged boomer, it's that you turn other shit down. So why is that wrong? Well, yes, you can get more volume using a compressor, but you've got two problems. If the sound source doesn't need compression, what you're doing is you're dulling that down. You're stopping its dynamic range. If it doesn't need compression, leave it alone. Adding compression to something that doesn't need it is going to make it sound not as exciting as it should be. And the thing that people do with a compressor to get more volume out of it is to turn up the output gain. So all you're actually doing is fucking up your headroom. And by fucking up your headroom, you're getting closer to digital distortion, particularly in the box. So a lot of people will say, but Jamie, when I turn all the other faders down, my mix isn't as loud. Well, that's dead easy to sort out. Take your master fader and turn it up. or use a trim plugin and add some extra output to your master volume. And the other thing I get is, oh, but when I turn everything down, it's not as exciting when I'm like mixing it. All right, turn the speakers up then. Easy. Don't use a compressor to get more volume. It's there to stop dynamic range, not add volume. Next up, you can record great vocals with a Shure SM58. Yeah, it's true. Alright, this might sound a bit weird, but if an SM58 works on a singer's voice, then use it. Simple as that. I've talked about the fact that we're obsessed by gear in this game. I mean, you shouldn't just be reaching for the most expensive microphone just because it's the most expensive microphone. The best microphone for a singer is the one that sounds best on their voice. Easy as that. I've worked in studios with £10,000 microphones and they have sounded shite on some voices. And I've ended up using something that is way cheaper but sounded way better. So if it works, just get it done. And believe it or not, there's some pretty high profile singers out there that prefer the sound of the SM58 in the studio, such as Rod Stewart, Bono and Billy Idol. And they've made millions doing this. So they must be doing something right. Not to mention they'll be using the most gifted producers and greatest studios available to them. So if the SM58 works, use it. Alright, next up, and a topic I've talked about a lot, amp sims are better than real amps. False. Sorry. If you've got a really great sounding amplifier, cranked up and cooking, with a great microphone, placed really well through a great preamp, it will sound magical. And this kind of goes back to the analog versus digital thing. The thing about digital amps is they're recreating the sound. They're taking a snapshot in time of stuff. And that doesn't sound as good as a real amp. You've got to think about real amps and you've got to think about analog as this living, breathing thing. Digital stuff doesn't have that. It makes a recreation the best it possibly can, and they're always a snapshot in time. Now again, I'm not saying that amp sims sound terrible, they sound great, but they don't sound as good as the real thing. They are, however, super convenient and super consistent. It can be really hard to get a consistent good sound session after session from a real amp, particularly when you're just starting out. I've made records with amp sims, I've made records with Mesa Boogies, Fenders, Marshalls, the lot, and I'm always going to go for a real amp first. Not saying that the sims don't do a good job, but it's just not as good as the real thing. And last, and controversially, Streaky knows loads about mastering. False. I've watched that guy's channel for a while and I've been shouting, screaming and swearing at some of the content I see. He's really good at content, but if he's using the techniques that he's telling everyone to use, then he doesn't know shit about mastering. Always be wary of a person that tells you should always do the same thing every single time. Music doesn't work like that. I saw a short where he was saying you should be taking out like 180 out of every mix to get clarity in the low end. But if you have a mix that doesn't have a lot in that region and you take more out, you're not going to get more clarity, you're just going to get weakness. The thing about YouTube, and the irony of it is that here I am telling you what you should and shouldn't be doing, is that anybody can upload. I can think of a few really popular creators that really give shit advice, and he is right up at the top of it. You can't standardize, you can't quantify art and music. It just doesn't work like that. And some of the advice that he gives is just fucking awful. Alright guys, I hope you found that useful and it gave me a chance to rant a little bit at the end there. Please do like, subscribe, comment, share, and if this stuff is useful to you, there's a link to buy me a coffee and I'll see you again next week. Cheers.